The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation conducts these yearly studies to see how people's attitudes towards communism are changing over time. And the results of this year's study are truly horrifying, I think. Reading now from the organization's report, here are what they call the key takeaways. Some of the key takeaways, anyway. I'm cherry picking a few of these here that are of special interest. It says, capitalism is still viewed more favorably than other economic systems, holding relatively steady at 61% favorability from 2018. Now, that's 61% overall. To me, that's pretty low. Only 61% of Americans, according to this study, are really in favor of capitalism. However, favorability of capitalism is lower among Generation Z and Millennials at only around 50%, down 6 points and 8 points from 2018, respectively. Communism is viewed favorably by more than 1 in 3 Millennials, 36%, up 8 points from 2018. Communism by 36% of Millennials. This, I hate to remind you, this is the generation that's taking over the country. They are inheriting the reins of power. When I say they, I mean we. And 36% of us are in favor of communism. 15% of millennials think the world would be better off if the Soviet Union still existed. A majority of Americans aged 35 and under trust themselves more than the community. But that's, okay, so 35 and under, majority trust themselves. 66% trust themselves more than the community or the government. But that means that 34% trust the community or the government more than they trust themselves. Think about that. While 50% of millennials say they are somewhat likely, and 20% of millennials say they are extremely likely to vote for a socialist candidate, doubling from 10% in 2018, Americans overall are more hesitant about voting for a Democrat socialist than they were last year. Now, this is all quite wrong, of course. I don't mean that the findings of the study are wrong. I think the findings line up with what you would expect. They ring true to me, even though they're horrifying. I mean, they're wrong in that the opinions held by many millennials with respect to this issue and with respect to almost every other issue you can think of are wrong. It might be too much to ask, given that people don't like to read anymore, especially read long books, but if everyone would just read the first volume, I've recommended this book a million times. If you would just read the first volume of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. He wrote a 3-volume work talking about his own experience in the Gulag, the Soviet Gulag, but also he kind of weaves that into the overall history of the Gulag system in the Soviet Union. It's a fascinating book. I've read the first 2 volumes. I haven't read the 3rd volume yet. But it'd be great to read all of them. If you could only read one, just read the first volume. And there's no way that you could read that book and come away from it still thinking that a socialist or communist system is a good idea. There's no way you could do it. These are systems where freedom, liberty, self-expression, self-determination, human flourishing, human well-being are not relevant. They simply don't factor in. Now, the fact that communist governments promise to take care of everybody and make sure that everyone's needs are provided for, and then fail always, every single time, to follow through on that promise, is almost beside the point. Because what happens when we have this conversation is people say, well, look at the bread lines in Venezuela or the empty grocery shelves. And this is supposed to prove the faults of this kind of system. But even though it's true that that does indicate serious problems with the social system, I think that's the wrong approach. Just observing all the bad things that have happened under communist and socialist governments is not enough, clearly. Now, when I recommended the Gulag Archipelago, it's not because it chronicles all the bad stuff, which it does, and does so powerfully and poignantly. The real powerful thing about the book, I think, is how it exposes the philosophical flaws with this system. And that's what we need to focus on communicating, is the philosophical problem with it. We need to focus on why it's a bad idea. Not just why it's bad in practice, not just the practical problems, even if they are significant practical problems, such as mass starvation is a practical problem, pretty significant one, I would think. But that clearly has not been, even if it should be enough for people to be convinced, it's not enough. And the reason is there's always a defense mechanism this defense mechanism has been built up. And it's a pretty effective mechanism. And that mechanism, that strategy, is the classic move of saying, well, hey, communism is a great idea, but it's just that it's usually not done right. And when you point to an example of a communist or socialist regime, Venezuela, China, Soviet Union, wherever, where there's been horrific results, you could always say, well, that's not real communism, or that's not real socialism. Or there's the more skeptical sounding version of this, where somebody says, communism is great in theory, just bad in practice. No, it's bad in theory. And the reason why it's always bad in practice is because it's bad in theory. And so we need to talk about that theory. Thank you for tuning into the Daily Wire, one of the fastest growing conservative media outlets in the entire country. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and a subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any of our content.